In today's video, I want to introduce something that I do for some of my clients. I call it a data platform assessment project. I'm just finishing one of these up now, and I thought it would be a good topic for a video. And so I've done several of these, and so I went through some of the past assessments that I've done and tried to pick out some commonalities between the write ups that I did. And so I came up with 10 areas of focus that when I'm performing a data platform assessment or a database assessment for a client. So let's just go over at a high level what's included, and why I do these. Typically, I do an assessment like this for a new client, bring them on board. And what I really like about these is it gives me a good chance to get into the environment and see how things are put together, see maybe where there are some weaknesses in the environment and also some strengths. And the other thing I like about it is it really gives clients familiar with me and my experience and the things that I bring to bring to the table. Normally, this is a quick hitter type project, 1 to 2 weeks, and it's not a full 40-hour per week type of engagement for me. It's kind of like, well, I spend a couple hours here and there over a day, and then kind of go out, uh, jot down some of my observations, and then go back in the environment and either look for something else or dig into something further that I found in the previous session. I really like to have access to the environment for the sake of efficiency. Like I said, I like to come in and out of the environment at different times, and it doesn't really work well if I have to wait for someone to grant me access into the environment or screen share with them or something like that. That's usually something that's going to hinder the efficiency of the engagement. And then at the end, I usually like to have a deliverable document that I go over with the client. We'll have a meeting and we'll go over the findings and any recommendations that I have. And sometimes there's follow up projects that stem out of this, uh, and we move forward with those recommendations. Okay, so let's get started. The first area of focus I like to look at is backup and recovery. So I like to look at how the database or databases are being backed up. Is a tool being used, or is it using native tools of whatever database is in use? And I like to look at the schedule of the backups and the retention, how long we're keeping those backups around. I like to see if transaction log backups are being taken as well, and I look at the backup destination. So I really like to see if a backup target in place that is external to the server that's being backed up. That way, if you lose the server, you might have backup available, and then you can move forward with that. I also like to see if the backups are using compression. And the last thing I like to look at is whether or not there's a regular restores being done to those backups, because the best way to validate your backups is to restore them and restore them on a regular basis, because it's very important over time to keep exercising that. And if things change, you could wind up with problems. Like if you, let's say a permissions change or something like that, you're not going to know something like that unless you actually are doing regular restores. And you don't want to be finding this stuff out when you've got an actual disaster on your hands. And I also do like to see that there's a disaster recovery plan, even a basic one in place, where someone has thought through, how they would recover if they lost their entire data center. And I guess the first step there is to make sure that you're at least sending that backup someplace external to your data center, periodically. Whatever you can afford to do, once a week, once a month, whatever makes sense in order to rebuild from. Remember, you're going to have to rebuild from the ground up with this, so you want to have it as recent as possible. And the next thing I like to look at is basic database maintenance and upkeep. So this would really involve index and statistics maintenance. So I want to make sure that statistics are being gathered on a regular basis. Statistics are something that the optimizer uses in order to come up with query plans. So it needs to know stuff like how many rows are in a table, or how many distinct values do I have for this particular column of this table. And it uses that information to come up with query plans. And it also uses indexes. And so indexes need to be maintained as well. And how relational databases normally work is like you go in and you delete data from a table. It doesn't physically delete it at that time. It just goes in and puts a little marker in there and says, oh, okay, this particular row is deleted. And then what that introduces is something called fragmentation. And so the only way to really get rid of that is to go and rebuild that index on a periodic basis. And what happens when you rebuild it is it compresses all that by getting rid of all of the deleted rows, so that everything is compact, and it's that's much more efficient for the database to go through rather than having all these fragments in your tables. The next thing I like to do is a cursory data model review. So I like to look at, how the database is laid out, whether or not there's referential integrity between the tables, basic statistics about the actual tables in the database. That's nice to have. You might not have that on your ERD, but you might have like a document that kind of lists, your row counts or your tables, just to give a vague idea of what we're dealing with. And so it's also important for if there's any like very key areas in the data model that we go over that and how that all works and how it's maintained. So that's the data model review. Next, we talk about security. So I like to take a look at whether or not users are being managed by groups or roles. So typically you do not want to have like when you're creating users in your database and and to be granting individual permissions to those users. It just makes maintenance very tedious and error prone. It's much better in most cases to be using roles or groups. You grant your permissions to the roles or groups, and then you grant those roles and groups to users. Then you have kind of like classifications of users. So instead of managing things on, let's say get 100 different users in your database and managing permissions for in 100 different ways, you might have like three or four different types of users for your system, like a read only user and a read write user. And so having these limited number of roles makes management much more efficient. I also like to look at whether or not data encryption is being used and what methodology or what's being used to implement the encryption, and does it meet the requirements of the system. And then I look at things like how is the database server accessible? Most of the time, a database server is going to be accessible via an external server or a client, and you're going to need to give the IP address or the DNS name for that server, as well as the port. And that port that you're communicating on should be locked down. You don't want to have that open to the intranet. Preferably you've got your database sitting behind a firewall, and then in order to access that database, you've got to get onto a VPN, and then that VPN server would allow you access to a server that has access to the database. Next, I like to look at monitoring. So, what is there anything in place? Any tools? Any homegrown scripts? Just what is in place, and hopefully there is something in place that's keeping an eye on your environment. Is the database up? Do you need additional space added for any of the data files that are supporting the database? Do you have any blocking locks going on? Do you have any resource constraints that you need to be aware of, whether it's a CPU being a CPU bottleneck, a memory bottleneck, or a disk shortage? These are all things that you want to be aware of. So those are the basics of monitoring that I like to look at and make sure are in place. And as we said before, I like to see that there's a disaster recovery plan in place. And we kind of touched on that in the backup and recovery section. And I like to look at performance management. So, what sorts of things are being done to ensure performance is operating at necessary levels? Is there a performance management tool in place? Do you have benchmarks for your queries, and you're regularly measuring those queries that they're performing at an acceptable level? Things like that. Just making sure that performance is running at an optimal and acceptable level. And then I like to see if there's any capacity planning going on when, and this really involves collection of necessary data. So do you have an idea of how many rows you have in all your tables? Do you have an idea of how large the data files that support your database are? And are you keeping track of this on a ongoing basis? Because the key to capacity planning is having this data over time. And what it will allow you to do is project what you think, where you think you'll be a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. And so you can effectively plan. So if you're going out and collecting like row count and data file information and storing it in a table in your database, you have that information and you can project going forward. Next thing I like to look at is if there's a change management process in place. So I like to see that there's something being followed. You don't want to just be applying changes. You want to have these changes, you want to have them documented so you have a historical audit trail of what's going on, and you want to follow a process. You want to be applying the changes hopefully into a lesser non-prod environment, whether it's dev or your test or whatever you have that's non-production, and where you typically apply and test things out before applying them to production. And as I said, it's really important to have this documentation so you can go back and see when changes are being done. And you could use like an issues management tool or whatever like that to record this information and documentation to, and even store your scripts and attach them onto these tickets. And then the last thing I like to look at is what tools are in place in order to manage the data. Are you just using this SQL Server Management Studio, or are you using something more advanced? Do you have tools that allow you to do a schema difference between your environment or a data difference between your environments? These are all things that can save a lot of time. In addition to, you can bring in tools that do a lot of the performance management and monitoring that I mentioned in these other areas of focus. Things like SolarWinds DPA. There are other tools from Datadog that I've recently started using. So these are all great tools that allow you to more effectively manage your environment and keep track of performance and monitor your environment. That's a quick rundown of what's involved with a database platform assessment. If anyone's interested in having one done, please let me know. And I hope you guys got something out of the video. I appreciate you guys watching. If you did, please like the video, consider subscribing to the channel. As always, drop your questions and comments below. And I'd really appreciate it if you share the channel with someone that you think would get something out of it. Talk to you later.